uh, Professor Najeeba Syed. Last week, if you were with us, we were talking about Prophet Muhammad as an example, an embodied example of bringing social justice to an unjust order, and what that means and what that looked like and what the Quran and Sunnah teach us about that. So this week, we're going to talk about interfaith alliances for social justice or for justice. So what I'm going to outline in the first part of my talk today is looking at some of the examples from the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that helped us think through what interfaith relations look like. And then I'll end with some practical examples for interreligious work towards social justice. So I've been a professor at Claremont School of Theology for the last 10 years, and I actually teach courses. I just finished one on managing interreligious nonprofits. I teach another course called Interreligious Justice Movement, and another class called Comparative Religious Practices of Restorative Justice. So one of the things that's been a joy in my work is to teach these justice-based courses, and every course that I teach, actually I teach another one called Interreligious Justice, Interreligious Leadership and Dialogue. Is within every course we have a Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Buddhist perspective. And then in many courses I've also been adding indigenous religious traditions or Native American writers as well. So as we build on our lecture from last week, remember we talked about the scholar Dr. Hamidullah, who mentioned that one of the ways that the Muslim ban, for instance, was broken during the time of the Prophet, when he experienced economic bans, familial bans in terms of engaging with the Muslim community, the very early part of his mission when the Muslim community in Mecca was in a state of vulnerability, because as we talked about last week, it was really more of those that were attracted to Islam in its early years of the mission of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were often those that were at the margin of society. So Dr. Hamidullah tells us that actually it's interesting because the way that that ban was overcome at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was that there were, as he mentioned, sort of these virtual people who were not Muslims who supported and broke the embargo against the Muslim community. So because of their virtue in believing that it was incorrect and not justice to seek vengeance against the Muslim community by banning them from economic access to and other forms of access, that in fact, so we have an example at the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of allies who, when Muslims were in a position of difficulty, that there were allies who supported the community. So I think it's important to remember that, because very, very often the conversation we have around interfaith relations will begin with a negative interpretation of the relationship between Muslims and those of other communities. And so it's not just, as I talked about last week, my lectures here are not about fiqh, are not about jurisprudence, they're about learning practical examples of what we can do in the work around justice and peace building in communities. So it's helpful to think through what are some of the examples that we have from our own history and our own stories. There's another example at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I think is really important, and this is the compact of Medina. So as the Muslims started off in the trajectory of the mission of the Prophet, as we talked about last week, particularly we focus on the early Meccan years, as the community moved into more power, they also moved into religious diversity. And one of the beautiful things about the Compact of Medina, it's referred to as a Constitution of Medina. It has many references, but I would encourage you to actually read the text of the Compact of Medina drafted by Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in his community, because what it does is, imagine this, 1400 years ago, it actually not just mentions Muslims, but it mentions those that are not Muslim, and it talks about the terms of the relationships between Muslims and people of other communities. And I think this is important because what it shows is when Muslims do have in this capacity, they had achieved a state of, over time, accumulation of the ability to access resources, whether it was wealth or land, that they still were concerned about the rights of religious minorities, the rights of other communities. And so, so I think this is an example that it's not just when Muslims need to rely, if they're in a state of lack of power or lack of access, that they rely on the allies of other traditions who can assist them in flourishing. But it's also when they have, and historically within the time of the Prophet, when they have access to power and there isn't a necessity to be able to get support, perhaps strategically, for a community to exist or organize, that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ recognized the importance of the rights of other religious communities. And so the Compact of Medina, I encourage you to read the Compact. We don't have time today, but we could actually go through and dissect the Compact of Medina. And the thing that I wanted to articulate here is that this is a really early example of what we would call a practice, a theology, a religious doctrine of religious pluralism. Religious pluralism is a recognition that there are multiple religious traditions and that they function, hopefully, within a society in some way to be able to coexist in ways that do not harm and damage one another. So I think it's a really wonderful example that we have from the early Muslim history. So I would encourage you to look at that, because it's a profound instrument that not just allowed for religious pluralism, but recognized religious pluralism and recognized the rights of others. And I think we could really think through conversations more effectively in our time. The other is that in addition to these sort of examples that are embodied, that we found in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's also really helpful to think about that the Quran tells us, for instance, more than once, that God could have made us all one religious community. God could have made us all of the same mind. And that in fact, the Quran tells us that diversity of human beings, both of religions, diversity of tribes, diversity of ethnicities, diversity of culture, is actually something that Allah planned for the human condition. So diversity is not something, religious diversity is not something that I as a Muslim should feel shame about. It's not something that I should have grief about. It's something that Allah tells us in the Quran, that this is part of God's design for human beings. And that in fact, as the Quran tells us, the task of the human, of all humans, is ta'arafu, to know one another and to get to know one another. And this get to know one another is not just hello, how are you, but it is getting into and being in relationship with one another. And so I think that's really important, because sometimes the way we approach religious diversity is, again, from a negative connotation, that, oh my goodness, there's religious diversity. Why isn't everyone of the same background, the same heritage, the same religious articulation? And in fact, as a Muslim, I would approach it and say, well, look, this is a sign from Allah. This is part of the condition of human beings. This is part of our condition on this earth. And the test for us is, do we make the effort to get to know one another? And in fact, the Quran tells us the best thing to compete with each other is in good works, is in doing good in the world. So interreligious engagement can be based on this notion of, this is a good thing that there is difference. This is a good thing that there is diversity. And what we want to do to take it to the next step is we want to think about what is the good that we are doing in our community, and how can we extend that good? How do we cooperate, interreligious cooperation? How do we extend our capacity to do good works in the world? There's also another really beautiful example early in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that I really want us to to think about. We know that the early Muslims were under so much stress. In fact, they were living under a level of stress and lack of safety that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ asked a delegation of them to go to Abyssinia, to historic Ethiopia, as now we would call it Ethiopia, and to seek refuge, asylum from the African nation at that time, as I mentioned, Abyssinia. And it was a Christian African dynasty. And I think this is a really important piece because, Muslims in the early part of their formation sought refuge in another. They left their city, they left that community and traveled across space. In that time, it was a significant amount of space. These days, we used to get on airplanes a couple of months ago and travel so quickly. But they traveled to another nation, and they traveled to and sought refuge from an African Christian king who gave them refuge after hearing one of the companions, Sahaba, recite Surah Maryam, talk about the Jesus in the Quran. And different commentators talk about what he did after he heard the story, because he was being challenged to not give them asylum. When the king heard the story, he said the difference between our religious traditions, and he drew a line in the sand saying, the difference between us, there's so much in common, and the differences rather exist. And yet we from what you have told me from your revelation, there is such a closeness between us. Always keeping in mind something I think that's important in the three examples that I've shared here about Prophet Muhammad's seerah in his lifetime and the companions of Sahaba around him, is that they were always, and in fact, there's another story of the Christians of Najran that came to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, spent a few days in discussion with him about theology, about God, about Jesus. And in fact, we know that they left still being Christian. And obviously Prophet Muhammad remained being Muslim, but they left in a position of respect for him, and he also respected them. And I would encourage you to read that story, the seerah of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But I mention these stories because I think what's helpful is that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the companions did not apologize for their beliefs. They did not give up their Muslim identity. In fact, what they brought to the table in these multi-faith settings was a deep commitment to their tradition. And I think that is helpful because sometimes we feel like if we're going to do multi-religious engagement, interfaith dialogue, and what we'll talk about later is interfaith work for justice, that we have to give up our religious tradition. Some people say that if you come into this space, you shouldn't speak to your beliefs in a passionate way. And I actually want to encourage us to think of these examples that I've shared from Prophet Muhammad's time, where the dialogue, the conversation, the alliances, all of them were based on Muslims maintaining their identity, maintaining their beliefs, being grounded in their religious tradition, being grounded in the Quran, being grounded in obviously at that time, if you had the rahmah, the capacity to be in the company of the Prophet, imagining that they did not give up that tenacity, that belief, that holding on to their religious tradition. So I think it's really important that when we talk about interfaith engagement and conversation, it's not about diluting your religious tradition. It's not about giving it up. It's about coming with all of your beliefs into a space that you are looking forward to some form of cooperation with others. So I think that's really important, because I can understand when I talk about interfaith work, sometimes people say, well, if I have to come to the table and you don't want me to be able to be fully who I am, then I don't want to be in that space. And I just want to assure you that the kind of multi-faith engagement Prophet Muhammad gives us an example for is a confidence in our religious tradition, a belief in it, And at the same time, embodying, as the Quran tells us on a regular basis, this idea of humility. So there's a difference between a confidence, a belief, a holding on to, a dearly engaged, sort of a dearly beloved feeling of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, his example, his teachings in the Quran. So you can come into a space with all of that. And I think humility is also an important part of this, that when we come together, it's about embodying, as the Quran tells us again and again, that those who walk on earth, that if someone comes and bothers them, that in fact, what their response is salam, say peace to them. So we hold on, we are confident in our belief system. And when we engage with people, both in our tradition, with other Muslims, and with people of other religious traditions, that arrogance is really not the modality of a Muslim. If we come into this conversation and we have an arrogant way of approaching it, then that is so another problem and extreme. And the Quran reminds us again and again what this disease of arrogance does to the heart. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the spiritual state of entering this world of interfaith dialogue, that first of all, we are grounded in our tradition, we are grounded in our teachings, we are grounded in our beliefs, we are grounded in our history, we are grounded in our heritage, we are grounded in the ways that Islam functions and exists, which is a beautiful thing. And we come into it with the Muslim demeanor of deep confidence in our tradition. And at the same time, we want to make sure that how we have a conversation comes from a place of humility. And here I mean humility in your demeanor. And I think that's really important, because if you come into these multi-religious spaces, and the foundation of humility is it allows us to listen. It allows us to listen to people we agree with, and it allows us to listen to people we don't agree with. And I just wanted to encourage you to think about that, because when you are in a conversation with someone that you disagree with, it's easy to be dismissive. It's easy to just throw it, the conversation aside or the person aside. But in fact, part of humility allows us to be a good listener, and it allows us to actually offer a better critical perspective. If you are not listening to what the person is saying and you're not engaging, then you're not really having a discussion or a conversation. So some of the things that I have found in particular that are really important in the multi-religious work for justice, and I'm thinking about this particularly right now, as we're hearing really difficult stories of violence across the United States. For those of you that are joining from the United States, I was looking, I'm not from Minneapolis, I'm here in Los Angeles, but I was hearing about multi-faith, leaders on the ground in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was recently murdered by the police. And one of the really powerful stories that came out was an organization called Ma'un. I would encourage you to look at them. And one of the things that was really important about the organization and the Imam Al-Amin and others that were doing work there is that you could see that one of the responses to police violence, both in this time and historically, has been with religious leaders of different communities, that it wasn't just one religious community, but in fact the Muslim community has been deeply embedded in the Minnesota landscape. And I think that's really, really important, because interfaith and multi-faith work has to be grounded in community. It has to be grounded in local community. It has to be grounded in relationships. So I'd encourage you to look up this organization, Ma'un. And sometimes when we hear of a crisis in another city or in another place, the immediate response is to want to intervene in some way. But I encourage you, as you're hearing stories, we now know that there was a police shooting as well, and unfortunately fatal, of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. Instead of, if you're from the outside, listen to who the faith leaders are in the community, and let's try to think about what are the existing multi-faith relationships that are there that we can support and engage with. So I just wanted to, a lot of people are looking for action, And action is, I think, best served when you first look at who is already on the ground doing the work and find ways to support that. And I just wanted to share that because a lot of people often, when they think about, I've heard some masajid or some folks who want to help out to understand that, sorry, I have a little bit sick, to understand that there are already people doing work. If you're new to justice work, if you're new or it's not in your city, research and see who's already doing the work on the ground. And there might be ways that you can support an existing faith or multi-faith approach to whatever the crisis is within a particular community. I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I just wanted to share with you some in the last couple of days, if not, last couple of weeks have been incredibly challenging with the amount of violence that we have seen perpetrated, particularly against the Black community here in the United States. So I just wanted to encourage you first, before you step in and do work, look also at the Muslim organizations that can connect you locally, but those that are doing the work, like the Muslim Anti-Racism Coalition, Muslim ARC, and other groups that are doing that type of work. So in general, I wanted to first speak to the moment, obviously, that we're in, but also to consider on multiple issues of justice. When you're working in a multi-faith setting for justice, there are a couple of things that I think are helpful to consider. First of all is each community at the table needs to articulate and explore what their definitions of justice are, because there is not always a uniform approach to justice. Last week, we talked about the Muslim contribution, the Sunnah or the Prophet Muhammad's approach to justice and how it was articulated. So for instance, in the Jewish community, Tikkun Olam, the healing of the world, in the Christian scripture, the notion of peacemakers and their role, the notion of justice, how you treat your neighbors. I think it's helpful to have each community share what are their approaches to definitions of justice, because I think sometimes we get together and we say we're here to work for justice, and I don't think that there's always a universal approach to justice. And I think it's really important to have a more open and universal definition of justice at times, but it's also important to understand where we differ. Maybe not everyone is defining justice in the same way. And so I just wanted to mention that. And that's a good time to understand that multi-faith engagement is also an intellectual engagement. It's not merely action in the streets, but what does a Muslim member bring to that conversation? And what do you learn from hearing from a Buddhist practitioner at the table? What do you learn about justice? How do we enrich the conversation instead of reducing it to one approach, instead of reducing it to one definition of justice? How do we articulate and understand? So this is really important. Before you can do multi-faith work, I think it's really important to be grounded in the Muslim tradition, as some of the examples that I gave you earlier. If you are not knowledgeable about your own tradition, then when people ask you questions, you won't be able to explain what is the definition of justice within the Muslim tradition. So I think it's really important as a Muslim, if you think about the multi-faith work around justice, you really have to have a clarity on what justice means to you, but you also have to have a clarity on why you're doing multi-faith work. What in the Muslim tradition supports multi-faith work? You have to be very clear about that. And that clarity for everyone around the table of different traditions, before you go into action, before you jump into doing things together, have that conversation. It is a religious literacy conversation where you become more literate about your religious tradition and with each other. I often tell people, when we come together as either scholars or activists for multi-faith justice work, it should sharpen our pen. It shouldn't dilute us as scholars and activists. It should actually sharpen our pen and sharpen our strategies. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that it's important to work in times of peace before a conflict or a crisis comes up, to work in times of peace together. Because what can happen is a lot of times multi-faith activism or interreligious justice work happens, as we've seen, as I mentioned, the rise, will happen when there's a particular crisis. Sometimes a crisis happens abroad and it influences interfaith relations in the United States. Sometimes a crisis happens here in cities and communities in the United States. So you can imagine if the first time you reach out to the Jewish community is when the synagogue is bombed, or the first time that the Muslim community is hears from people of other religions is when the mosque has been vandalized, or the first time you think to have a conversation across your whole city is when there has been serious violence targeting one community member or a whole community. So I always encourage people, before you get to that point, spend some time together in building relationships. So multi-faith engagement for justice is an educational process, as we talked about in point number 1. It's also a relational process, that you don't start off with the difficult issues the moment you meet one another. You don't start off with the things that are hard to resolve between different religions. You start off with building relationships, with breaking bread, with visiting each other's places, visiting each other's sites. I mean, one of the things that's been most effective for me is taking people to a church, a mosque, a synagogue, and visiting each other's spaces. Because you can talk about a religion, I can have a speaker come in, but it's very different to actually see a whole community practice their tradition. And here, it doesn't mean that you participate necessarily, that you go in. If you are visiting a church, you can sit and observe. You don't have to be a part of the worship, because if, first of all, that may be problematic. You may not feel comfortable, but also the worship may be something that, as we said, within going into this work with confidence, that you maintain your religious identity. It's not about becoming Christian. It's not about even necessarily sharing in the worship of Christian practice. You maintain your boundary as a Muslim. It's being in that space and observing and learning about other religious traditions. I can't tell you how many times when I bring my graduate students both to Islamic Center and other masjids, how much it changes their perspective. Because suddenly they see men, women, children, they see a whole family, they see what it means to live as a Muslim. And this lived religion, that's what scholars call it, this lived religion component is only something you can learn when you experience one another's traditions. So I really wanted to encourage you to think about, don't wait for a crisis to knock on each other's doors. Don't wait for a crisis to reach out to one another of different religious traditions, and actually spend that time before you're at the crisis. So that when you are, unfortunately, as we see, when there's racist violence, or there's violence based on religious background, Islamophobia, if there are other acts of anti-Semitism, whatever they're religiously based, and as we talked about, racism as well, the factors that lead into violence. I think it's really important that you build those relationships, study with each other, get to know each other, spend time with each other, so that you can face those crises together. And that the phone call is already there. The imam and the rabbi are already on the phone together because they know each other. I have a story of two very religiously conservative communities in Orange County, a Muslim community and a Christian community, both very conservative communities. And those two communities, before they brought together the individuals, the imam and the pastor met for almost a year together on a regular basis, because they knew, and I wanted to make that clear, that you can be religiously very strict in your practice and your interpretation and still do multi-religious work. What they did in that scenario is they knew that it would take a year to get their communities ready to even meet one another. So sometimes a religious leadership has to take the time, has to spend the time to educate each of their communities about the other. You don't want to just bring people together before they're ready and create conflict and go backwards in the multi-religious work. So I think that's really important, is take time to know each other, spend time if you can in times of peace. The other thing that I wanted to have you think about, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the role of worship and ritual in multi-faith engagement. So when I do multi-religious engagement, particularly on social justice, one of the big issues I've been working on with other leaders across the city of Los Angeles is the detention of immigrants by ICE and the mass incarceration, particularly the role of private prison companies that are profiting off the incarceration of human beings. And one of the things we were very clear about, and I would encourage you to look at Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. CLUE is one of the organizations that does this work. LA Voice is another organization in Los Angeles that does this work with people of different religious traditions. One of the things that I felt was really important is that to come into that space as a religious person. So when we would do actions in front of a private prison company, in front of the detention centers or jails, each religious community would have a time and to share, whether it was a prayer, whether it was a ritual, but to keep that integrity of each community, so that the contribution didn't and the ritual or the interfaith justice work didn't become all of us just melding into one common identity, but we all created and shared. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we did an action in front of the detention center in downtown Los Angeles. We had, at that time, it was Isra and Mi'raj, it was the Sikh holiday of Vaisakhi, it was Passover, and it was also Easter. So instead of doing one ritual that encompassed all of them, each community had a space and time to share what were the basis of the justice piece from that particular holiday, that particular religious tradition. So I think it's really important to keep in mind and think about, what does ritual and worship look like, so that we don't come together and feel like we have to encompass and all be of one background, but to respect what each community brings to the table. The other thing that I think is really important is to build local grassroots relationships. So this work can be done nationally. Sometimes you'll see marches in DC, you'll see, national religious leaders, but I think the most effective work is actually done very locally, and not even just in Los Angeles, but in neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So one of the ways that I have my interreligious dialogue and leadership students, I have them actually map their community when they start my class. I have people from all over the world that come for that course. And what they find out is that sometimes they didn't realize how much religious diversity was even in the space around them. So I was thinking about the Islamic Center, one of the interreligious things that happens, but it's not called interreligious. And something that my children and I participate in is the food pantry on Saturdays. Before the pandemic, we would go very regularly and serve food to the families that were in need and that began to count on the food supplies. That is also a justice practice. Justice doesn't have to be just marching against policy issues. It can also be addressing the crisis that exists here in Los Angeles, and I'm sure in other cities, the crisis of families that are they live without shelter, and they live in very precarious economic situations. This idea of food justice or access to food is a huge issue. So that is something that faith communities have been on the forefront of. So part of this local work was the mosque is building this food pantry. It's been going on for several years now. And just a beautiful story. I was with my kids a couple of months ago serving food. What we do is that we collect a week's supply and give it to families who come to collect. And the people that come to support, the people that come to rely on this service are actually mostly people who are not necessarily Muslim, that are not all mosque going, but they're people who can live or walk within walking distance of the mosque. After we give out the food to the folks that come in line, then we go to the park that's across the street from the mosque and give out meals there. So what this kind of localized justice work does is it is interfaith, because it is one faith community serving whoever is in their area. And I think this is a really profound way. Imam Warith Deen, who, rahimahullah, one of the great leaders of Islam in the United States, talked about this as it is sort of a theology of neighborliness, that the Quran and the Sunnah tell us that we have to serve those that we are neighbors with. And that extension of neighbors, different scholars have, the limitations of how many houses in this direction or that direction. And I think this is really important because not only is it our personal neighbors, but it's the neighbors of our houses of worship. If we're spending money, it's an injustice to spend $25 million on a dome or building your mosque without, it's not an injustice in itself to do that, but not to take into account, are you benefiting the community around you? Are you building something that will support the practices of those that are dealing with injustice of food, injustice of support of housing? So I think it's a really beautiful example that we think through who and how are we doing this local grassroots street block by block justice work, and to seek out partners that are already doing that work. I mentioned that earlier, that you don't want to jump in and try to save a situation. You want to work with those that are already there. But this idea of neighborliness, this idea of how do we do justice work that's interfaith by its very nature, because we don't care who the neighbor is. I don't ask, are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Are you Christian? And then I will feed you. I will try to make sure that you're housed. In our tradition, that is a right of your neighbor, whatever their background is. And so I wanted to encourage us to think about interreligious work. Another thing that we have often to consider in multi-faith justice work is that it's very effective to actually interrupt, as we talked about last week, interrupt systems of power, to do it in a multi-religious setting. Because I'll give you an example. There was a local elected official who was not meeting with one of their constituencies, who was a DACA recipient. For those of you who are not aware, there are over 700, I think it's 700,000, I can't remember the exact number, please don't quote me on it, of people who are waiting to have a confirmation. There was an Obama era program that gave a form of a pathway to legal citizenship for those that it was quite stringent, the requirements that they had to come under. And this has been challenged by this current administration. And so we're waiting actually within the next couple of weeks, a Supreme Court decision that will either validate or invalidate that program and affect just so many people that are on the front lines of service in the United States, particularly in this era of the pandemic. So there was a congressperson who, an elected official, I think, who wasn't meeting with a constituent that was a DACA recipient, someone within their district. And instead of just having a pastor, this person was not Muslim. This person, I think, that was Christian. Instead of just sending a pastor in to go justice work, to interrupt, this idea of interrupting a practice that was unjust. The practice was unjust not to meet with this individual. We actually sent a delegation of a pastor, a rabbi, Muslim leaders, Jewish leaders, people who don't follow any one particular religious tradition. So this delegation is sitting outside the office of this elected official. And so you can imagine this elected official is seeing these people of different religious traditions come out and say, this is an unjust decision that you're not taking into account the needs of this person who is a part of your community, who is dealing with a very complex and difficult migration status issue. So that elected official relented. We weren't sure. Sometimes the interruption means moving into more escalated, always nonviolent action, but just the visual of seeing these different religious leaders come to the table, it was really enough for this elected official to say, wait, these people are here, and people of all these different religious traditions see this as an injustice issue. They're here to witness the injustice. Almost every religious tradition talks about the witnessing, the standing for truth against injustice. We talked about that last week from the Muslim tradition. So it really shifted that whole scenario and ended up becoming one in which those constituents were able to have their needs met. So to think through that when we are challenging power, it's something you can do on your own. But if you're challenging things like unjust systems we talked about earlier, whether it's police violence, whether it's issues of migration, that having a coalition, really frankly these days visually, is so important because that coalition brings so much power to the table. And I think that that also shows that strategically when you're doing interfaith justice work, it shows that this is not just a Muslim issue, this is not just a Christian issue, this is an issue that affects people, this is an issue that people feel is unjust from different backgrounds. So to kind of hone in on this fifth point, it's important to stand for issues that don't just affect you as an individual or a community. It's important that when another community is being affected, that you stand up for justice. So in the work that I do, that means as a Muslim, I don't narrowly define that I'll only be here for this one particular issue. Solidarity is about standing up whether or not you are always affected by the issue, whether or not, as sometimes we say, you have skin in the game. And I think that's really the challenge to interreligious justice work is, do we have an ethic? Do we have a notion of justice that transcends just that which affects me? And that's where this idea of solidarity is so important, and standing together. And as I pointed out, it's not just standing together because we believe it's right, but it actually is also just more effective. Last of all, I'm going to end with this point, is that when we think about interreligious justice movements or interreligious work, you can't do away with the notions or categories or identities of race, class, and other factors. So for someone who is dealing with anti-Black racism as a Muslim, within the multi-religious work, that means those that are non-Black Muslims, Muslims of other backgrounds, we have to keep in mind that injustice doesn't affect everyone the same way, and listen for how communities that are dealing particularly with forms of historical oppression and injustice, how it affects those communities. And part of the solidarity work is also, we call intra-faith work, not just interfaith work, but intra-faith work. So I felt like I couldn't leave this discussion today without speaking, as we did last week, looking inward. What are the injustices in our community? What are the injustices of racism? The injustices, there are injustices around class. By class, I mean access to wealth. And how are institutions of our Muslim community supporting that and questioning that? What are the injustices around ableism? Ableism are when there are individuals dealing with different disabilities, are our masajid accessible to them? Are the ways that we teach accessible? I think one of the things that I hope we continue, I'm going to end in about 2 minutes, but one of the things that I hope that we continue to think about is how we've been broadcasting so many of our programs online. That makes it more accessible to people who can't physically come to the mosque. And I hope that we actually continue to do that, because accessibility is something, I really think that is one of the edges that Muslim communities have to deal with. Mental health issues, that's also something that our communities have to be much more forthright about dealing with, taking away the stigma of accessing help. Recognizing what are the injustices that people who have mental health, who are dealing with mental health issues, what are the injustices they face, and having the mosque, instead of be a place that pushes them away or excludes them or maybe even criminalizes them. I've seen folks that need mental health services, and when they come to the mosque, instead of us being a place that helps with that, criminalizing it and trying to seek trying to seek ways to exclude them. I think that's really important that we think through some of these edges of where some Muslim communities and mosques and religious organizations are far ahead in that work, and some of us are just beginning to understand. So to recap the conversation today, there's so much more that we could talk about, but to recap the conversation today, we have examples historically in the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where multi-faith relationships were important in times when support was necessary, but also when Muslims were in times of prosperity, they also were still important. And in fact, religious pluralism was a very important factor in the ways that Muslims related to others in the time of the Prophet. That in fact it was, as we talked about, the Ethiopian community, the Abyssinian community that offered refuge to the Muslim community very early on. So we have so many examples of how Muslims dealt and engaged with diversity in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And then we talked about sort of 6 points today of how to think through multi-faith engagement in our time. One of them is to explore the definitions of justice, to be grounded in our religious traditions of our own, to work before a crisis happens, to think of the role of worship and ritual when we do multi-faith engagement. We talked about building local grassroots relationships, and that if we want to assist in other scenarios or in other communities, don't jump in and try to take over, but learn and support and understand what's already happening on the ground. And that our own institutions should exhibit and embody, as we talked about Imam Warithdin's idea of a theology of neighborliness, of serving the whole community that surrounds us, regardless of their faith background, that it's important. And we have a long history of Muslims doing that in the United States, particularly the Black Muslim community all over the United States has been serving people in the broad range of their community and learning from that example. That part of our goal and our role in multi-faith relations for justice is to interrupt systems of oppression together. We talked about an example of that it's it's not just about standing up when my community is affected, but standing up when other communities are affected to build trust so that we stand in solidarity in multiple situations, and that when we want to ask for help, we have to also have given help. I mean, that's a basic human concept, but also a deeply religious idea of mutuality, that we don't just take, we also are generous in our giving. And we ended also with this notion that we have to pay attention to that justice and injustice are not equally experienced by all communities, and hearing and listening to communities within the Muslim spaces that are dealing with forms of injustice, economic, racial, ableist, whatever those may be, and they can all be intertwined. In fact, there could be a community affected by all of those, that we think about how our institutions are supporting, unfortunately, some of those practices, and what needs to be done as a community to serve those needs, not just externally, but also internally with our community. Shukran, jazakumullah. It was a pleasure to be with all of you today.